Hey guys, it's Karina here with another video. So today's video is going to be about the book of Daniel and two stories in particular that I took a new interpretation of. And so the first one I want to talk about is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So if you don't already know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the time where Nebuchadnezzar ruled in Israel. So in this time he ruled and he wanted everyone to praise to his God. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said no, they didn't want to praise his God, that they trusted in their God. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't really like that, and he said, well, if you're not going to believe in my God and you're going to believe in your own God, I'm going to throw you in the fire. And it's really interesting because we first just see this story as, kind of a miracle, because when they're thrown in the fire, they survive. They end up dancing in the fire. And it's just a really cool story because something I took from it was that we have such a unique God. Our God is willing to walk through that fire with us. God was in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was dancing in that fire with them. There is no other God who would walk through the fire with his people. And it just shows how powerful our God is. And the fact that he rescued these three men from the furnace is just mind-blowing and amazing. And it just also shows the incredible courage that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to stand up against the king, the highest person. So it'd be like me standing up against the president or the prime minister in Canada and saying, I'm going to stick with my God, and then him saying, I'm going to throw you in the fire. Would you still stand up for your God in that moment? And we all want to say yes, but would we really actually? And it's just really cool to put ourselves in that scenario and realize what courage it took for them to stand up for their God in that moment and say, yeah, I will stand in my God because I have that much faith in him, And it's just really a mind-blowing moment. Yeah, so after seeing the men walk out of the furnace unharmed, King Nebuchadnezzar explained that no other God is able to save like this. And that was a very true statement. There is no other God who walks through the fire with his people. God, through Jesus Christ, took on suffering and death of his people at the cross to rescue them, ultimately from suffering and death. Like these three Hebrews, Jesus was held captive under the pagan world empire Rome, and he was handed over to die, and then he emerged 3 days later. When Jesus emerged from the death, he commissioned his disciples to take the gospel to the ends of the earth because his blood was spilled to redeem people from the God of every tribe, language, and nation. In Daniel 3, the pagan king praised the Hebrew gods and prohibited the people of any nation or language from speaking against him. God's deliverance and message of salvation are always meant to be declared among all nations. So this is just from the Jesus Bible. It was it just breaks down the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And in this section, it kind of just explains how amazing what God did was, and how he rescued his people, and how he walked through the fire with them. And just another passage that kind of relates to this whole story. In Isaiah 43:2, it says, "When you pass through waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze." Again, just explaining how God will walk through the fire with us. He will walk through every battle we go through. He will be there by our side, no matter what we're going through. And that's just such a comforting thought. And just gives so much more power to the story when you actually take that into consideration. And yeah, it's really cool. So yeah, Daniel 3-4 kind of goes over the story of Nebuchadnezzar, and it also goes a bit into some other stuff about Daniel interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. And so yeah, it's a really interesting section to read, and I highly encourage you read it. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel in the Lion's Den is a very similar story in the sense it's about another king, King Darius, who once again worshipped for his God, and Daniel stands against him and says that he's going to trust in his God, and as a consequence he's thrown into the lion's den. And the verse that really sticks out to me is when it says in verse 23, chapter 6, "And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted God." And that just goes to show, like, if we come out of life trusting God, there'll be no wound on us. There'll be no burden. There'll be nothing left on us. We'll be clean when we die. Like, we will be clean and ready for heaven. Like, it's such a neat thought to think. If we trust in God, we will be wound free. He will keep us clean. He won't keep us from pain, but he will protect us. That's not to say we won't feel pain, and just because we trust in God we won't feel pain. I'm not trying to say that at all. We still feel pain, but to know that God will protect us from the lions. The den is a really but to know God will protect us from the lions in our life is a really comforting thought. He's not going to protect us from everything, but he will protect us from the big things, and that's what's really important and comforting when you read this story over again. So it's really interesting how he comes out of the den with not a single wound. So this story can be easily compared to the story of Jesus. So in this breakdown, it says that this episode points to Jesus. Like Daniel, Jesus was unjustly condemned by his enemies. The pagan ruler Pontius Pilate, though he knew Jesus was innocent, agreed to send him to his death. He placed him in a pit, a tomb, and he had sealed a stone and rolled over it. Both rose victoriously from the pit. However, Daniel didn't experience death. Jesus did. Daniel didn't defeat death in his own power, but Jesus did. Daniel and Jesus were both faithful to God, but Jesus conquered death so that believers can have victory over sin and death through him. So the biggest difference here is that Daniel didn't defeat death in his own power, but Jesus did. So you might wonder, why did Daniel die, or why did Jesus die and Daniel didn't die, or vice versa. But as that sentence explains, Daniel didn't defeat death. He was there to prove that God could protect him, but Jesus, he wasn't his goal to prove that God could protect him and save. The goal was to prove that he could conquer death in his story. But it's very interesting to see the parallels between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and often a lot of the stories in the Old Testament will relate to Jesus' story. I kind of related it to, when I read the passage earlier, it kind of related the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to Jesus' story as well. So it's very interesting to see the commonalities and resemblances between the Old and New Testament, and between Jesus' story and the Old Testament, and just foreshadows what Jesus' life was yet to come, and what was going to happen in his lifetime. And so it's just like the whole Old Testament is leading up to Jesus' life, and then you see all these commonalities between the two books, and it's just really interesting to make those connections, because you know, you don't really make those connections when you hear those stories in church or when you heard them as little kids. But reading it again and having a study Bible that explains things is really helpful as well. That way it can explain to you how it's similar to Jesus' story as well. And it just makes it so cool that there's so many unique coincidences and commonalities between both testaments. Anyway, so yeah, that's my insight from Daniel. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys have a great week. And know that if God put you to it, he'll put you through it. Bye, guys.